done is, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about Marsh. I see some familiar faces that some of you may not know. It is a property of approximately 3,000 acres with 2 landowners. We are only the stewards of it, Friends of Marsh. It is a nonprofit organization, was formed in 1985. Marsh was a brainchild of Environment Canada in '67 to celebrate the bicentennial, the centennial of Canada. And there was 13 biomes, specific regions in Canada that were chosen to have an interpretive center built on them. Of those, actually 9 got built, and we're the only one that's still operating in its original premise, much expanded from the government days. In 1985, the political whim was totally different, and they decided to pull out of interpretive centers and withdrew funding. And the Friends of Marsh was formed. The community rallied around behind the center, and it has been running as a nonprofit since, with no core funding, I might add. It's always a bane of our existence. So that's it in a nutshell. The M&R owns most of the land. The federal government, Environment Canada, owns where the building is and about 130 hectares. And it was given the designation National Wildlife Area. The provincial area, of course, is a provincial wildlife area. The site was chosen because it was beside this unique wetland. Marsh has quite a history. It actually is part of the Severn Sound watershed, and its origins are from Orr Lake, through the the Wye River to the Marsh, all the way to Georgian Bay. The Marsh is actually was established in 6800 BC. And we had a volunteer in 1990 that did a lot of research in cooperation with ROM and published a report, and I'll refer to that a few times, Mr. Chittenden, and it's quite an interesting report. If anybody is interested, I have it electronically, thanks to Dr. Schottick. The Marsh is comprised, as I said, of about 3,000 acres, the whole valley. About that, 2/3 of it is one form of wetland or another. That can comprise fen, swamp, bog, or the marsh itself. They're all different categories of wetlands. They all are defined by the acidity of the water and soils, the plant life and plant communities that reside in them. And Marsh is such a diverse place. It has all types of wetlands and the species associated with it. We actually have 14 species at risk residing in the valley, along with a lot of plant species that are rare either in Ontario or Simcoe County. We've had some research done recently, and we will be continuing this over the next few years with a push on doing some baseline inventories just to get a handle on exactly what is out there. We have a couple of unique animals, actually. The green frog, which is quite common in wetlands. We're one of the few places in Ontario that has a blue phase of it, and it is a brilliant blue body on a green frog. It's a really neat animal. Just one of the unique residents of the area. Now, the Marsh has had a lot of ups and downs since it started in, as I said, 6800 BC. And most of it has been the result of glaciation and then the rebound of the earth. Once the ice shields fell back, Orr Lake used to go all the way to almost where Georgian Bay is, and Marsh didn't exist. As the land rose, there were some changes in the area, and the marsh was actually formed. Now, the land is still rebounding, and they figure it's around 11 feet per century. So it's coming back up on a gradual basis. As that rises, of course, access to Georgian Bay is reduced. And there are different water level fluctuations in the Georgian Bay and the Great Lakes region. We are affected, the Marsh itself was affected by many years by the exit of water through Lake Michigan in Chicago and down in Sarnia at the St. Clair River, which of course has had major dredging over the last few years. Georgian Bay water levels have fluctuated up to 6 feet on any given century, and that's happened quite a few times if you go through the history in the area. And there's still a lot of discussion on what is the real level of Georgian Bay because of this huge fluctuation and the land that keeps lifting. Originally, Georgian Bay used to flood back into Marsh. That doesn't happen anymore. There is a dam that Ducks Unlimited and Ministry of Natural Resources put in at the end of the Wye River, and it's beneficial because it actually holds the water back into the marsh. And it's, at any time, it can be 5 to 6 feet higher than the Wye River as it exits to Georgian Bay. The climate change, which I know you've heard a little bit about today, they were talking about the ice up in the Arctic, it definitely affects lake levels. And we've seen a lot of changes in the last 5 years, and it's cyclical. And yes, we have quite a diverse number of critters there. So in the marsh itself, it is a unique area to southern Georgian Bay. It is considered a coastal wetland. It has a lot of jobs. Not only is it a nursery for life, most species in the world are tied to a wetland in one form or another. Either they start their life there, they eat there, or they're dependent on something that is raised in the wetland. Without these wetlands, our world would be a totally different place. And I'm sure most of you are converts and know that a minimum of 70% in Ontario of the wetlands have been destroyed or changed or disappeared in the last 50 to 70 years. Yes, isn't that, they're actually on the endangered species list as a species of concern now, snapping turtles. So, laying eggs, yes. Now, some of the challenges of the wetlands, from our perspective, Wye Marsh has always had open water in Mud Lake. And even myself, 15 years ago, I used to canoe through the valley. Well, you can't do that anymore. There's sections that are totally blocked. Mud Lake has shrunk. And there's a couple of reasons. The water levels have fluctuated, obviously. There's been some human intervention in Wye Marsh basically since the late 60s. Our cell, where we do most of our interpretive education, is man-made. There's another cell at the other end of the valley, Preston Cell, that was man-made as well by Ducks Unlimited. Unfortunately, the valley cannot be, the marsh itself cannot have successful control and mitigation methods used there like they'd use at Tiny Marsh just because of the sheer size of the marsh. They've tried a few times and the results have been dismal. Right now in the marsh itself we have kilometer-wide mats of cattail that float, and they shut off channels. So if you get out there, it will shut behind you on a windy day, and then you have difficulties pulling yourself through, which I've had to do. There are some issues with invasive species in the marsh, and of course that's a worldwide problem. In a wetland, these invasive species can tend to consume more water as well as take over habitat than the native species would. And our species that we have issues with, and the slides should come up shortly, are purple loosestrife, which we can honestly say we have that under control. But our cattail growth has been absolutely explosive. Before Severn Sound Environmental Association, which used to be the RAP group, got working on this watershed and actually worked with farmers and municipalities to reduce the effluent going into the streams, it all ended up in the marsh. And there's historical storage of nutrients in the wetland itself. This will be there for hundreds of years. There's a huge load of nitrogen. The cattail is still accessing this nitrogen to have this explosive growth pattern. As well, the two known species of cattail, broadleaf and narrowleaf, have hybridized, and they have actually formed a new species that is not affected by changes of water level in some of the control methods that have been traditionally used. So the cattail growth is huge. The other one is glossy buckthorn, which is a small shrub tree, and it was again brought from Europe, and we've been working very diligently to get it out from around the center with hundreds of volunteers. But it only self-generates underneath itself. It shuts out invasive species. The last one that's a huge concern, and we really haven't addressed it yet because there is no proved method of control in a wetland, is Phragmites, or common reed grass. That is becoming extremely invasive in the middle of the marsh and is taking over habitat. And when you see these areas of either cattail or Phragmites, nothing lives in them. They become a barren desert. We are currently doing some inventories on some existing old channels that you can still see in aerial photographs. And we're doing some research to see exactly if what is living there. The river goes underneath some of this cattail mat, and it's too dark for anything to live underneath it. There are some benthic organisms there. That's a very talented staff member that took a lot of these. And if we get the approvals and we get all the environmental assessments done, then we're hoping to open up a little section of this cattail and actually make it accessible again. Wetlands are dynamic. They never stand still. There is natural succession in any wetland. Over thousands of years, a wetland will turn into a forest. It will. It will eventually fill up with sediment, detritus, decaying vegetation. It will eventually, the water levels and the course of the water will change, and you'll get grasses and sedges, and it's a very, very, very slow process. Unfortunately, in the marsh, it's been sped up by invasives and by this historic nutrient bed that's sitting in there. The vegetation is just taking over. So we're currently looking at different ways. We don't want to stop succession because we're not trying to interfere with nature. We just want to slow it down. Now, wetlands are crucial to our planet's health. They purify water. When we do a lot of education programs with grade 10 students, they actually do the water quality testing. And we get them to do it different sections of the marsh, and we have some historical data, and it's amazing the quality of water leaving the wetland going into Georgian Bay. It's almost pristine. When it comes in times we've had heavy metals come in. As I said, we've had nutrient loading. The wetlands actually purify, and that's one of the jobs of cattails. Now, shortly, I think there should be a series of maps. I'm not really keeping an eye on that. Has that come up yet? Okay, there will be a series of 4 maps come up, and they fade one to the other. You have to really look carefully, because what it does, it shows over the last 20 years from historic aerial photos the actual change in the marsh itself, from open water to stands of cattail. And it's quite shocking when you look. We used to have 140 acres of open water, and now I think we have less than 2. Yeah, it is shocking. So it's, again, marshes are dynamic. They're changing. They're always changing. But we want to slow this change. We want to maintain the quality of our wetlands. And we use this as a teaching example across Ontario. Marsh gets over 22,000 school children through every year. And they get a hands-on experience in a wetland. Everybody that comes usually dip nets. Everybody that is allowed, according to liability and regulations of the different school boards, they actually get out in the canoes and the kayaks that you see here. They go birding. They do GPS. We try to lose them, which occasionally works, but then we have a major search. But I mean, usually the ones that are lost are the ones that do it intentionally. Now I lost my I got off track again. But while I'm waiting for these maps, I wanted to read this by Roger Chittenden. It's in his conclusion. The way he did the historical data for the Marsh, they actually did a core sample in 1990, and they did it in the middle of Mud Lake, which they consider was the historic center of the original marsh. They did pollen testing, vegetation testing, and he came up with the history, not only from the vegetation side of things, what species actually lived there and how much pollen they produced and what critters, but also they carbon dated a lot of the debris that was found, and that's how we got the date of this actually young marsh. Marsh is a very young marsh. So it started as a lagoon in Nipissing Great Lakes. It formed as a result of steadily falling water levels, and as marshes go, is a young marsh. It contains, on average, 3 feet of water, not a lot. And the only place it's deeper than that is where it's been dredged by man. based on the mean water level of Georgian Bay falling at the rate of 14 inches per century, Roger in 1990 predicted that in 250 years' time, water will no longer enter the marsh from the bay. Now this is without the dam in place. Occasionally when the Georgian Bay water levels get high enough in a spring thaw, we do get backflow into the marsh. That doesn't happen anymore. If the climate becomes wetter and colder, the process will take longer. If warmer and drier, the process will be quicker. So the marsh will eventually draw down. But it does get the supply from Orr Lake, and as long as that continues, there was a perfect example of a cattail mat. With Orr Lake continuing to feed the marsh, McDonald Creek and some other small streams that run into the marsh, then we should have fairly standard water levels. Because we've raised the dam, the water level in the marsh is actually higher than it's been in the last 8 years. When I started, we were canoeing in the mud. But we've actually used the beavers to retain some water we've changed some of the management practices for the marsh. And you see a very healthy ecosystem here. The critters that have been on these slides are out day in, day out during the summer, broad daylight. You see this when you come. Of course, it has to be sunny to see that many turtles. But we have an extremely healthy population. This year, more than ever, we've been finding Blanding's turtles, which is an endangered species in Ontario, and we have a very large population of breeding Blanding's turtle, which is really cool. The other species at risk, which is substantially breeding in the marsh, is the least bittern. We have the largest population known in Ontario as a breeding colony. And they move around the marsh as the channels change and the water levels change as well. The last slide, the Canada geese. That's a real problem. People don't like them. People think they're invasive. We have kind of helped their population explode. I don't know if you realize this, but Canada geese and trumpeter swans were reintroduced in numbers in Ontario in the same year. Trumpeter swans just became self-sustaining 2 years ago. Canada geese have overridden the golf courses. They love short grass. They do not depend on a wetland for life. They can nest in any small water body. They don't need a wetland. These guys do. They are dependent on water. This is their habitat, and this is why it's been so difficult. It's taken 20 plus years to reintroduce the trumpeter swans into Ontario. Now, the wetland is not only an ecological gem, it's also, it's also a huge property that we can use to educate the younger generation. The unfortunate part is we only get school kids twice during their school, guaranteed. We get them once in grade 4 or 7, and we get them usually once in high school. It's unfortunate that I am an environmental science teacher, and I think 2 years after I got that designation, that was no longer teachable. Every teacher is supposed to teach it, but then again, not every teacher has the capacity. They have too much else on their plate. We serve a huge role in filling that gap in the school system. And the kids that come, the look on their face when they catch a frog or they find a fish or they touch an owl for the first time, that says it all. And that's what the marsh is all about. Yes, we have a beautiful wetland that we're trying to manage, that we're trying to save and conserve, but the message is the youth and our leaders of tomorrow, we have to get them to understand the dynamics, the interconnectedness of wetlands and ourselves. And any drop of water that falls in this area ends up in Marsh. So there's your connection. Here's our slides. This is 20 years ago. Gets a little smaller. This is all cattail mat coming in. And this is today. That's what's left of Mud Lake. It's closing in extremely rapidly. We have so many species that are dependent on this wetland, and this is what we're trying to address. Of course, we're not going to go up and it'd be nice to explode and bomb the place and open it up, but that just doesn't work because you're destroying habitat while you're at it. Here we see the dense stands of cattail. There's nothing in there, and it's floating. I'm not sure if they do an excellent job in Tiny Marsh, Ducks Unlimited. There's 4 cells, individual pockets of wetlands in Tiny. They actually draw it down and then they flood it, and that will control some of the cattail growth. They tried to do that in Marsh, and of course, being such a large wetland, it took 2 years to get the water out of it. And then when they flooded it, all the cattail mat just went pop. So now we have this huge mass that floats. This is the Phragmites, or the common reed grass. It's a very pretty ornamental grass, but it can grow up to 15 feet high. And this is the purple loosestrife. I'm sure you are all aware of that. That was a big news 8-10 years ago. It's pretty well under control in most wetlands in Ontario. The release of the beetles did wonders. Again, Phragmites. It becomes very, very thick, dense stands that spreads by rhizomes underground and tends to suck up a lot of water and just takes over edges and areas of wetland, creating basically, as I said, a monoculture where no species actually will thrive. And that's part of the issue with our invasives is our animals that live here don't know how to live in there. They don't know how to use that species. They don't eat it. They don't interact in those introduced species. It will come over time. Nature's usually very good at balancing things out. But it could be 1,000 years from now. It could be 10 years from now. We don't know. This is an example of a thick, thick, thick cattail mat. And when you try to walk on it, which I've done many times, no, it doesn't work. It's like walking on one of those boards that's on a roller, and you're liable to go for a swim. Now today, we are focusing more and more on stewardship in everything we do. We do education programs, yes, but I'm really changing the way we deliver our education programs. We're not giving an environmental education program in a box anymore. And traditionally we were tied to the school system and we were told you have to follow this curriculum, this curriculum, this curriculum. Well, we still do, but it's not in a box. What we do is we take the kids out and we actually put them to work. This year we had day camps coming up from Barrie that got a lesson on invasive species. They actually pulled some glossy buckthorn and they put some native species in their place. So the year before we did the same thing. And we had over 2,000 cadets from base Borden, which were cadets from all over Canada, came in, and it was the same thing. We put them to work. They got a program, they got educated, but they actually did some work in the marsh. We're trying to put the onus back on people, so that it's not just you come, you use the place. No, you interact with it. When you come to the marsh, you're asked to record species that you see if you know what you're looking for. We're preparing picture cards that you can take out with you to look and see what you find. We offer all sorts of interpretive programs. Yes, we mountain bike, we ski, we do eco-tours, we canoe, we kayak, we snowshoe, we run day camps, we run workshops on you name it. We're a multi-purpose facility, but the end goal is to get the message of environmental education out to the public. This is one of our latest programs, and rain deters flying these guys. That's Andy. That was his very first flight that got captured. And that in itself teaches a message of habitat. Now, the one thing we couldn't do this is without our volunteers. And I see some volunteers here today. We have over 500 volunteers on our roster. And without them, we couldn't do what we do. They help in every aspect of the center, from teaching to fixing canoes to entering data, you name it. It's a fully accessible facility with all sorts of equipment you can use year-round. one of the few interactive wetland systems left in the province of Ontario. As you know, outdoor education centers are becoming few and far between. They're getting harder and harder to fund. I can attest to that, but we stay open. It's a constant challenge for funding, but we manage to do it year to year. And I have brought today what I think is the signature for Y Marsh, and there's a number of reasons why. This is Adele. Yeah. She is 8 weeks old. Y Marsh has been involved in the Trumpeter Swan program since 1985, and they have just reached over 1,400 birds in the wild. We were one of the main cooperators since day one. We are the only treatment center that's functioning right now that will take sick and injured swans. And Adele here, unfortunately, the nest was torn apart by a bear, and oh no, she'll settle down. And there was one egg left that wasn't eaten, and since we breed birds of prey at another facility, we put the egg in an incubator, and out came Adele. One thing I wanted to say was, this is a signature bird for a wetland species, a signature species for the wetland, and it's so crucial that we keep wetlands to keep the diversity of species that are in there alive and healthy. But also it's very crucial to our health. If you notice, Ducks Unlimited changed their slogan 2 years ago to healthy wetlands, healthy people. We need to tie our health to the wetlands, to the water, because that's where it all starts. How long do swans live? 20 years average in the wild, probably, and I know in our most birds in captivity will live much longer. But she's going to be sort of half captive, half wild, but usable for education. You don't dare go near a wild swan. They can break your leg, especially in nesting season. They are very strong, very big animals. The swans stand my shoulder high. Their wingspan is 3 meters. So the wetland, as I said, is one of the few interactive centers left in Ontario. And to quote Chittenden to close, Y Marsh is a microcosm of the upper Great Lakes. It's a valuable mechanism to cope with the effluent of the farmlands, control flooding, and at the same time preserve green space and the wildlife of wetlands. Why let it trickle away? And our slogan for the next 5 years is based on stewardship. The Y Marsh is in your hands. Thank you.